Section 12 of A General View of Positivism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Oxnard. A General View of Positivism by Auguste Comte. Translated by John Henry Bridges. Chapter 3. The Action of Positivism upon the Working Classes. Part 3. Property has been erroneously represented by most modern jurists as conferring an absolute right upon the possessor, irrespectively of the good or bad use made of it. This view is instinctively felt by the working classes to be unsound, and all true philosophers will agree with them. It is an antisocial theory, due historically to exaggerated reaction against previous legislation of a peculiarly oppressive kind. But it has no real foundation, either in justice or in fact. Property can neither be created nor even transmitted by the sole agency of its possessor. The cooperation of the public is always necessary, whether in the assertion of the general principle or in the application of it to each special case. Therefore, the tenure of property is not to be regarded as a purely individual right. In every age and in every country, the state has intervened to a greater or less degree, making property subservient to social requirements. Taxation evidently gives the public an interest in the private fortune of each individual, an interest which, instead of diminishing with the progress of civilization, has always been on the increase, especially in modern times, now that the connection of each member of society with the whole is becoming more apparent. The practice of confiscation, which also is in universal use, shows that in certain extreme cases, the community considers itself authorized to assume entire possession of private property. Confiscation has, it is true, been abolished for a time in France, but this isolated exception is due only to the abuses which recently accompanied the exercise of what was in itself an undoubted right. And it will hardly survive when the causes which led to it are forgotten, and the power which introduced it has passed away. In their abstract views of property, then, communists are perfectly able to maintain their ground against the jurists. They are right again in dissenting as deeply as they do from the economists, who lay it down as an absolute principle that the application of wealth should be entirely unrestricted by society. This error, like the one just spoken of, is attributable to instances of unjustifiable interference. But it is utterly opposed to all sound philosophical teaching, although it has certain appearance of truth, insofar as it recognizes the subordination of social phenomena to natural laws. But the economists seem to have adopted this important principle only to show how incapable they are of comprehending it. Before they applied the conception of law to the higher phenomena of nature, they ought to have made themselves well acquainted with its meaning, as applied to the lower and more simple phenomena. Not having done so, they have been utterly blind to the fact that the order of nature becomes more and more modifiable as it grows more complicated. This conception lies at the very root of our whole practical life. Therefore nothing can excuse the metaphysical school of economists for systematically resisting the intervention of human wisdom in the various departments of social action. That the movement of society is subject to natural laws is certain, but this truth, instead of inducing us to abandon all efforts to modify society, should rather lead to a wiser application of such efforts, since they are at once more efficacious and more necessary in social phenomena than in any other. So far, therefore, the fundamental principle of communism is one in which the positivist school must obviously adopt. Positivism not only confirms this principle, but widens its scope, by showing its application to other departments of human life, by insisting that, not wealth only, but that all our powers shall be devoted in the true republican spirit to the continuous service of the community. The long period of revolution which has elapsed since the Middle Ages has encouraged individualism in the moral world, as in the intellectual it has fostered the specializing tendency. but both are equally inconsistent with the final order of modern society. In all healthy conditions of humanity, the citizen, whatever his position, has been regarded as a public functionary, whose duties and claims were determined more or less distinctly by his faculties. The case of property is certainly no exception to this general principle. Proprietorship is regarded by the positivist as an important social function, the function, namely, of creating and administering that capital by means of which each generation lays the foundation for the operations of its successor. This is the only tenable view of property, and wisely interpreted, it is one which, while ennobling to its possessor, does not exclude a due measure of freedom. It will in fact place his position on a firmer basis than ever. But the agreement here pointed out between sociological science and the spontaneous inspirations of popular judgment goes no farther. Positivists accept and indeed enlarge the program of communism, but we reject its practical solution on the ground that it is at once inadequate and subversive. The chief difference between our own solution and theirs is that we substitute moral agencies for political. Thus we come again to our leading principle of separating spiritual from temporal power, a principle which, disregarded as it has hitherto been in the system of modern renovators, will be found in every one of the important problems of our time to be the sole possible issue. In the present case, while throwing such light on the fallacy of communism, it should lead us to excuse the fallacy by reminding us that politicians of every accredited school are equally guilty of it. At a time when there are so very few, even of cultivated minds, who have a clear conception of this, the primary principle of modern politics, it would be harsh to blame the people for still accepting a result of revolutionary empiricism, which is so universally adopted by other classes. I need not enter here into any detailed criticism of the utopian scheme of Plato. It was conclusively refuted 22 centuries ago by the great Aristotle, who thus exemplified the organic character by which, even in its earliest manifestations, the positive spirit is distinguished. In modern communism, moreover, there is one fatal inconsistency, which, while it proves the utter weakness of the system, testifies at the same time to the honourable character of the motives from which it arose. Modern communism differs from the ancient, as expounded by Plato, in not making women and children common as well as property, a result to which the principle itself obviously leads. Yet this, the only consistent view of communism, is adopted by none but very few literary men, whose affections, in themselves too feeble, have been perverted by vicious intellectual training. Our untaught proletaries, who are the only communists worthy our consideration, are nobly inconsistent in this respect. Indivisible as their erroneous system is, they only adopt that side of it which touches on their social requirements. The other side is repugnant to all their highest instincts, and they utterly repudiate it. Without discussing these chimerical schemes in detail, it will be well to expose the errors inherent in the method of reasoning which leads to them, because they are common to all the other progressive schools, the positivist school excepted. The mistake consists, in the first place, in disregarding or even denying the natural laws which regulate social phenomena, and secondly, in resorting to political agencies where moral agency is the real thing needed. The inadequacy and the danger of the various utopian systems which are now setting up their rival claims to bring about the regeneration of society are all attributable in reality to these two closely connected errors. For the sake of clearness, I shall continue to refer specially to communism as the most prominent of these systems, but it will be easy to extend the bearing of my remarks to all the rest. The ignorance of the true laws of social life under which communists labour is evident in their dangerous tendency to suppress individuality. Not only do they ignore the inherent preponderance in our nature of the personal instincts, but they forget that, in the collective organism, the separation of functions is a feature no less essential than the cooperation of functions. Suppose for a moment that the connection between men could be made such that they were physically inseparable, as has been actually the case with twins in certain cases of monstrosity. Society would obviously be impossible. Extravagant as this supposition is, it may illustrate the fact that in social life, individuality cannot be dispensed with. It is necessary in order to admit of that variety of simultaneous efforts which constitutes the immense superiority of the social organism over every individual life. The great problem for man is to harmonize as far as possible the freedom resulting from isolation with the equally urgent necessity for convergence. To dwell exclusively upon the necessity of convergence would tend to undermine not merely our practical energy, but our true dignity, since it would do away with the sense of personal responsibility. In exceptional cases where life is spent in forced subjection to domestic authority, the comforts of home are often not enough to prevent existence from becoming an intolerable burden, simply from the want of sufficient independence. What would it be then if everybody stood in a similar position of dependence towards a community that was indifferent to his happiness? Yet no less a danger than this would be the result of adopting any of those utopian schemes which sacrifice true liberty to uncontrolled equality, or even to an exaggerated sense of fraternity. Wide as the divergence between positivism and the economic schools is, positivists adopt substantially the strictures which they have passed upon communism, especially those of Dunoyer, their most advanced writer. There is another point in which communism is equally inconsistent with the laws of sociology. Acting under false views of the constitution of our modern industrial system, it proposes to remove its directors, who form so essential a part of it. An army can no more exist without officers than without soldiers, and this elementary truth holds good of industry as well as of war. The organization of modern industry has not been found practicable as yet, but the germ of such organization lies unquestionably in the division which has arisen spontaneously between capitalist and workman. No great works could be undertaken if each worker were also to be a director, or if the management, instead of being fixed, were entrusted to a passive and irresponsible body. It is evident that under the present system of industry there is a tendency to a constant enlargement of undertakings. Each fresh step leads at once to still further extension. Now this tendency, so far from being opposed to the interests of the working classes, is a condition which will most seriously facilitate the real organization of our material existence, as soon as we have a moral authority competent to control it. For it is only the larger employers that the spiritual power can hope to penetrate with a strong and habitual sense of duty to their subordinates. Without a sufficient concentration of material power, the means of satisfying the claims of morality would be found wanting, except at such exorbitant sacrifices as would be incompatible with all industrial progress. This is the weak point of every plan of reform which limits itself to the mode of acquiring power, whether public power or private, instead of aiming at controlling its use in whoseever hands it may be placed. It leads to a waste of those forces which, when rightly used, form our principal resource in dealing with grave social difficulties. The motives, therefore, from which modern communism has arisen, however estimable, lead at present, in the want of proper scientific teaching, to a very wrong view both of the nature of the disease and of its remedy. A heavier reproach against it is, that in one point it shows a manifest insufficiency of social instinct. Communists boast of their spirit of social union, but they limit it to the union of the present generation, stopping short of historical continuity, which yet is the principal characteristic of humanity. When they have matured their moral growth, and have followed out in time that connection which at present they only recognize in space, they will at once see the necessity of these general conditions, which at present they would reject. They will understand the importance of inheritance as the natural means by which each generation transmits to its successor the result of its own labours, and the means of improving them. The necessity of inheritance, as far as the community is concerned, is evident, and its extension to the individual is an obvious consequence. But whatever reproaches communists may deserve in this respect are equally applicable to all the other progressive sects. They are all pervaded by an anti-historic spirit. which leads them to conceive of society as though it had no ancestors, and this, although their own ideas for the most part can have no bearing except upon posterity. Serious as these errors are, a philosophic mind will treat the communism of our day, so far as it is adopted in good faith, with indulgence, whether he look at the motives from which it arose or at the practical results which will follow from it. Serious as these errors are, a philosophic mind will treat the communism of our day, so far as it is adopted in good faith, with indulgence, whether he look at the motives from which it arose or at the practical results which will follow from it. It is hardly fair to criticize the intrinsic merits of a doctrine, the whole meaning and value of which are relative to the peculiar phase of society in which it is proposed. Communism has its own way discharged an important function. It has brought prominently forward the greatest of social problems, and, if we accept the recent positivist explanation, its mode of stating it has never been surpassed. And let no one suppose that it would have been enough simply to state the problem without hazarding any solution of it. Those who think so do not understand the exigencies of man's feeble intellect. In far easier subjects than this, it is impossible to give prolonged attention to questions which are simply asked, without any attempt to answer them. Suppose, for instance, that Gall and Broussais had limited themselves to a simple statement of their great problems, without venturing on any solution. Their principles, however incontestable, would have been barren of result, for want of that motive power of renovation which nothing can give but a systematic solution of some kind or other, hazardous as the attempt must be at first. Now it is hardly likely that we should be able to evade this condition of our mental faculties in subjects which are not only of the highest difficulty, but also more exposed than any others to the influence of passion. Besides, when we compare the errors of communism with those of other social doctrines which have recently received official sanction, we shall feel more disposed to palliate them. Are they, for instance, more shallow and more really dangerous than the absurd and chimerical notion which was accepted in France for a whole generation, and is still upheld by so many political teachers, the notion that the great revolution has found its final issue in the constitutional system of government, a system peculiar to England during her stage of transition? Moreover, our so-called conservatives only escape the errors of communism by evading or ignoring its problems, though they are becoming every day more urgent. Whenever they are induced to deal with them, they render themselves liable to exactly the same dangers, dangers common to all schools which reject the division of the two powers, and which consequently are forever trying to make legislation do the work of morality. Accordingly, we see the governing classes nowadays upholding institutions of a thoroughly communist character, such as almshouses, foundling hospitals, etc., while popular feeling strongly and rightly condemns such institutions as being incompatible with that healthy growth of home affection which should be common to all ranks. Were it not that communism is provisionally useful in antagonizing other doctrines equally erroneous, it would have then no real importance, except that due to the motives which originated it, since its practical solution is far too chimerical and subversive ever to obtain acceptance. Yet from the high morality of these motives, it will probably maintain and increase its influence until our working men find that their wants can be more effectually satisfied by gentler and surer means. Our republican system seems at first favourable to the scheme, but it cannot fail soon to have the reverse effect, because, while adopting the social principle which constitutes the real merit of communism, it repudiates its mischievous illusions. In France, at all events, where property is so easy to acquire and is consequently so generally enjoyed, the doctrine cannot lead to much practical harm. Rather, its reaction will be beneficial, because it will fix men's minds more seriously on the just claims of the people. The danger is far greater in other parts of Western Europe, especially in England, where aristocratic influence is less undermined, and where consequently the working classes are less advanced and more oppressed. And even in Catholic countries where individualism and anarchy have been met by a truer sense of fraternity, communistic disturbances can only be avoided finally by a more rapid dissemination of positivism, which will ultimately dispel all social illusions by offering the true solution of the questions that gave rise to them. The nature of the evil shows us at once that the remedy we seek must be almost entirely of a moral kind. This truth, based as it is on real knowledge of human nature, the people will soon come to feel instinctively. And here communists are, without knowing it, preparing the way for the ascendancy of Positivism. They are forcing upon men's notice in the strongest possible way a problem to which no peaceable and satisfactory solution can be given, except by the new philosophy. That philosophy, abandoning all useless and irritating discussions as to the origin of wealth and the extent of its possession, proceeds at once to the moral rules which should regulate it as a social function. The distribution of power among men, of material power especially, lies so far beyond our means of intervention that to set it before us as our main object to rectify the defects of the natural order in this respect would be to waste our short life in barren and interminable disputes. The chief concerns of the public is that power, in whosever hands it may be placed, should be exercised for their benefit, and this is a point to which we may direct our efforts with far greater effect. Besides, by regulating the employment of wealth, we do, indirectly, modify its tenure, for the mode in which wealth is held has some secondary influence over the right use of it. The regulations required should be moral, not political in their source, general, not special in their application. Those who accept them will do so of their own free will, under the influence of their education. Thus their obedience, while steadily maintained, will have, as Aristotle long ago observed, the merit of voluntary action. By converting private property into a public function, we would subject it to no tyrannical interference, for this, by the destruction of free impulse and responsibility, would prove most deeply degrading to man's character. Indeed, the comparison of proprietors with public functionaries will frequently be applied in the inverse sense, with the view, that is, of strengthening the latter rather than of weakening the former. The true principle of republicanism is that all forces shall work together for the common good. With this view we have, on the one hand, to determine precisely what it is that the common good requires, and on the other, to develop the temper of mind most likely to satisfy the requirement. The conditions requisite for these two objects are a recognized code of principles, an adequate education, and a healthy direction of public opinion. For such conditions, we must look principally to the philosophic body which Positivism proposes to establish at the apex of modern society. Doubtless this purely moral influence would not be sufficient of itself. Human frailty is such that government, in the ordinary sense of the word, will have as before to repress by force the more palpable and more dangerous class of delinquencies. But this additional control, though necessary, will not fill so important a place as it did in the Middle Ages under the sway of Catholicism. Spiritual rewards and punishments will preponderate over temporal in proportion as human development evokes a stronger sense of the ties which unite each with all by the threefold bond of feeling, thought, and action. End of section 12. Section 13 of A General View of Positivism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Oxnard. A General View of Positivism by Auguste Comte. Translated by John Henry Bridges. Chapter 3. The Action of Positivism upon the Working Classes. Part 4. Positivism, being more pacific and more efficacious than communism, because more true, is also broader and more complete in its solution of great social problems. The superficial view of property, springing too often from envious motives, which condemns inheritance because it admits of possession without labour, is not subversive merely, but narrow. From the moral point of view, we see at once the radical weakness of these empirical reproaches. They show blindness to the fact that this mode of transmitting wealth is really that which is most likely to call out the temper requisite for its right employment. It saves the mind and the heart from the mean and sordid habits which are so often engendered by slow accumulation of capital. The man who is born to wealth is more likely to feel the wish to be respected, And thus those whom we are inclined to condemn as idlers may very easily become the most useful of the rich classes under a wise reorganization of opinions and habits. Of course, too, since with the advance of civilization, the difficulty of living without industry increases, the class that we are speaking of becomes more and more exceptional. In every way, then, it is a most serious mistake to wish to upset society on account of abuses which are already in course of removal, and which admit of conversion to a most beneficial purpose. Again, another feature in which the positivist solution surpasses the communist is the remarkable completeness of its application. Communism takes no account of anything but wealth, as if wealth were the only power in modern society badly distributed and administered. In reality, there are greater abuses connected with almost every other power that man possesses, and especially with the powers of intellect. Yet these, our visionaries, make not the smallest attempt to rectify. Positivism, being the only doctrine that embraces the whole sphere of human existence, is therefore the only doctrine that can elevate social feeling to its proper place by extending it to all departments of human activity without exception. Identification, in a moral sense, of private functions with public duties is even more necessary in the case of the scientific man or the artist than in that of the proprietor, whether we look at the source from which his powers proceed or at the object to which they should be directed. Yet the men who wish to make material wealth common, the only kind of wealth that can be held exclusively by an individual, never extend their utopian scheme to intellectual wealth, in which it would be far more admissible. In fact, the apostles of communism often come forward as zealous supporters of what they call literary property. Such inconsistencies show the shallowness of the system. It proclaims its own failure in the very cases that are most favorable for the application. The extension of the principle here suggested would expose at once the inexpediency of political regulations on the subject and the necessity of moral rules, for these and these only can ensure the right use of all our faculties without distinction. Intellectual effort, to be of any value, must be spontaneous, and it is doubtless an instinctive sense of this truth which prevents communists from subjecting intellectual faculties to their utopian regulations. But positivism can deal with these faculties which stand in the most urgent need of wise direction without inconsistency and without disturbance. It leaves to them their fair measure of free action, and in the case of other faculties which, though less eminent, are hardly less dangerous to repress, it strengthens their freedom. When a pure morality arises capable of impressing a social tendency upon every phase of human activity, the freer our action becomes, the more useful will it be to the public. The tendency of modern civilization, far from impeding private industry, is to entrust it more and more with functions, especially with those of a material kind, which were originally left to government. Unfortunately, this tendency, which is very evident, leads economists into the mistake of supposing that industry may be left altogether without organization. All that it really proves is that the influence of moral principles is gradually preponderating over that of governmental regulations. The method which is peculiar to positivism of solving our great social problems by moral agencies will be found applicable also to the settlement of industrial disputes, so far as the popular claims involved are well founded. These claims will thus become clear from all tendency to disorder and will consequently gain immensely in force, especially when they are seen to be consistent with principles which are freely accepted by all, and when they are supported by a philosophic body of known impartiality and enlightenment. This spiritual power, while impressing on the people the duty of respecting their temporal leaders, will impose duties upon these latter, which they will find impossible to evade. As all classes will have received a common education, they will all alike be penetrated with the general principles on which these special obligations will rest. And these weapons, derived from no source but that of feeling and reason, and aided solely by public opinion, will wield an influence over practical life of which nothing in the present day can give any conception. We might compare it with the influence of Catholicism in the Middle Ages, only that men are too apt to attribute the results of Catholicism to the chimerical hopes and fears which it inspired, rather than to the energy with which praise and blame were distributed. With the new spiritual power, praise and blame will form the only resource, but it will be developed and consolidated to a degree which, as I have before shown, was impossible for Catholicism. This is the only real solution of the disputes that are so constantly arising between workmen and their employers. Both parties will look to this philosophic authority as a supreme court of arbitration. In estimating its importance, we must not forget that the antagonism of employer and employed has not yet been pushed to its full consequences. The struggle between wealth and numbers would have been far more serious, but for the fact that combination, without which there can be no struggle worth speaking of, has hitherto only been permitted to the capitalist. It is true that in England combinations of workmen are not legally prohibited, but in that country they are not yet sufficiently emancipated, either intellectually or morally, to make such use of the power as would be the case in France. When French workmen are allowed to concert their plans as freely as their employers, the antagonism of interests that will then arise will make both sides feel the need of a moral power to arbitrate between them. Not that the conciliating influence of such a power will ever be such as to do away entirely with extreme measures, but it will greatly restrict their application, and in cases where they are unavoidable, will mitigate their excesses. Such measures should be limited on both sides to refusal of cooperation, a power which every free agent ought to be allowed to exercise, on his own personal responsibility, with the object of impressing on those who are teaching him unjustly the importance of the services which he has been rendering. The workman is not to be compelled to work any more than the capitalist to direct. Any abuse of this extreme protest on either side will of course be disapproved by the moral power, but the option of making the protest is always to be reserved to each element in the collective organism by virtue of his natural independence. In the most settled times, functionaries have always been allowed to suspend their services on special occasions. It was done frequently in the Middle Ages by priests, professors, judges, etc. All we have to do is to regulate this privilege and embody it into the industrial system. This will be one of the secondary duties of the philosophic body, who will naturally be consulted on most of these occasions, as on all others of public or private moment. The formal sanction which it may give to a suspension of positive prohibition of work would render such a measure far more effective than it is at present. The operation of the measure is but partial at present, but it might in this way extend first to all who belong to the same trade, then to other branches of industry, and even ultimately to every Western nation that accepts the same spiritual guides. Of course, persons who think themselves aggrieved may always resort to this extreme course on their own responsibility, against the advice of the philosophic body. True spiritual power confines itself to giving counsel, it never commands. But in such cases, unless the advice given by the philosophers has been wrong, the suspension of work is not likely to be sufficiently general to bring about any important result. This theory of trade unions is in fact in the industrial world what the power of insurrection is with regard to the higher social functions. It is an ultimate resource which every collective organism must reserve. The principle is the same in the simpler and more ordinary cases as in the more unusual and important. In both, the intervention of the philosophic body, whether solicited or not, whether its purpose be to organize popular effort or to repress it, will largely influence the result. We are now in a position to state with more precision the main practical difference between the policy of Positivism and that of Communism or of Socialism. All progressive political schools agree in concentrating their attention upon the problem: how to give the people their proper place as a component element of modern society, which ever since the Middle Ages has been tending more and more distinctly to its normal mode of existence. They also agree that the two great requirements of the working classes are the organization of education and the organization of labor. But here their agreement ends. When the means of effecting these two objects have to be considered, positivists find themselves at issue with all other progressive schools. They maintain that the organization of industry must be based upon the organization of education. It is commonly supposed that both may be begun simultaneously, or indeed that labor may be organized irrespectively of education. It may seem as if we are making too much of a mere question of arrangement, yet the difference is one which affects the whole character and method of social reconstruction. The plan usually followed is simply a repetition of the old attempt to reconstruct politically without waiting for spiritual reconstruction. In other words, to raise the social edifice before its intellectual and moral foundations have been laid. Hence the attempts made to satisfy popular requirements by measures of a purely political kind, because they appear to meet the evil directly, a course which is as useless as it is destructive. Positivism, on the contrary, substitutes for such agencies an influence which is sure and peaceful, although it be gradual and indirect. The influence of a more enlightened morality, supported by a purer state of public opinion, such opinion being organized by competent minds and diffused freely amongst the people. In fact, the whole question, whether the solution of the twofold problem before us is to be empirical, revolutionary, and therefore confined simply to France, or whether it is to be consistent, pacific, and applicable to the whole of Western Europe, depends upon the preference of the postponement of the organization of labor to the organization of education. This conclusion involves a brief explanation of the general system of education which Positivism will introduce. This the new spiritual power regards as its principal function and as its most efficient means of satisfying the working classes in all reasonable demands. It was the great social virtue of Catholicism that it introduced for the first time, as far as circumstances permitted, a system of education common to all classes without distinction, not excepting even those who were still slaves. It was a vast undertaking, yet essential to its purpose of founding a spiritual power which was to be independent of the temporal power. Apart from its temporary value, it has left us one imperishable principle, namely that in all education worthy of the name, moral training should be regarded as of greater importance than scientific teaching. Catholic education, however, was of course extremely defective, owing partly to the circumstances of the time and partly to the weakness of the doctrine on which it rested. Having reference almost exclusively to the oppressed masses, the principal lesson which it taught was the duty of almost passive resignation, with the exception of certain obligations imposed upon rulers. Intellectual culture in any true sense there was none. All this was natural in a faith which directed men's highest efforts to an object unconnected with social life, and which taught that all phenomena of nature were regulated by an impenetrable will. Catholic education was consequently quite unsuited to any period but the Middle Ages, a period during which the advanced portion of humanity was gradually ridding itself of the ancient institution of slavery, by commuting it first into serfdom as a preliminary step to entire personal freedom. In the ancient world, Catholic education would have been too revolutionary. At the present time, it would be servile and inadequate. Its function was that of directing the long and difficult transition from the social life of antiquity to that of modern times. Personal emancipation once obtained, the working classes began to develop their powers and rise to their true position as a class, and they soon became conscious of intellectual and social wants, which Catholicism was wholly incapable of satisfying. And yet this is the only real system of universal education which the world has hitherto seen, for we cannot give that name to the so-called university system which metaphysicians began to introduce into Europe at the close of the Middle Ages, and which offered little more than the special instruction previously given to the priesthood, that is, the study of the Latin language with the dialectical training required for the defence of their doctrines. Morals were untaught except as part of the training of the professed theologian. All this metaphysical and literary instruction was of no great service to social evolution, except so far as it developed the critical power. It had, however, a certain indirect influence on the constructive movement, especially on the development of art. But its defects, both practical and theoretical, have been made more evident by its application to new classes of society, whose occupations, whether practical or speculative, required a very different kind of training. And thus, while claiming the title of universal, it never reached the working classes, even in Protestant countries, where each believer became to a certain extent his own priest. The theological method being obsolete and the metaphysical method inadequate, the task of founding an efficient system of popular education belongs to Positivism. The only doctrine capable of reconciling these two orders of conditions, the intellectual and the moral, which are equally necessary, but which since the Middle Ages have always proved incompatible. Positivist education, while securing the supremacy of the heart over the understanding more efficiently than Catholicism, will yet put no obstacle in the way of intellectual growth. The function of intellect, in education as in practical life, will be to regulate feeling, the culture of which, beginning at birth, will be maintained by constant exercise of the three classes of duties relative to self, to the family, and to society. I have already explained the mode in which the principles of universal morality will be finally coordinated, a task which, as I have shown, is connected with the principal function of the new spiritual power. I have now only to point out the paramount influence of morality on every part of positive education. It will be seen to be connected at first spontaneously and afterwards in a more systematic form with the entire system of human knowledge. Positive education, adapting itself to the requirements of the organism with which it has to deal, subordinates intellectual conditions to social. Social conditions are considered as the main object, intellectual as but the means of attaining it. Its principal aim is to induce the working classes to accept their high social function of supporting the spiritual power, while at the same time it will render them more efficient in their own special duties. Presuming that education extends from birth to manhood, we may divide it into two periods. The first ending with puberty, that is, at the beginning of the industrial apprenticeship. Education here should be essentially spontaneous, and should be carried on as far as possible in the bosom of the family. The only studies required should be of an aesthetic kind. In the second period, education takes a systematic form, consisting chiefly of a public course of scientific lectures, explaining the essential laws of the various orders of phenomena. These lectures will be the groundwork of moral science, which will coordinate the whole, and point out the relation of each part to the social purpose common to all. Thus, at about the time which long experience has fixed as that of legal majority, and when in most cases the term of apprenticeship closes, the workman will be prepared intellectually and morally for his public and private service. The first years of life, from infancy to the end of the period of second dentition, should be devoted to education of the physical powers, carried on under the superintendence of the parents, especially of the mother. Physical education, as usually practiced, is nothing but mere muscular exercise. But a more important object is that of training the senses and giving manual skill, so as to develop from the very first our powers of observation and action. Study in the ordinary acceptation there should be none during this period, not even reading or writing. An acquaintance with facts of various kinds, such as may spontaneously attract the growing powers of attention, will be the only instruction received. The philosophic system of the infant individual, like that of the infant species, consists in pure fetichism, and its natural development should not be disturbed by unwise interference. The only care of the parents will be to impress those feelings and habits for which a rational basis will be given at a later period. By taking every opportunity of calling the higher instincts into play, they will be laying down the best foundation for true morality. During the period of about 7 years comprised between the second dentition and puberty, education will become somewhat more systematic. But it will be limited to the culture of the fine arts, and it will be still most important, especially on moral grounds, to avoid separation from the family. The study of art should simply consist in practicing it more or less systematically. No formal lectures are necessary, at least for the purposes of general education, though of course for professional purposes they may still be required. There is no reason why these studies should not be carried on at home by the second generation of positivists, when the culture of the parents will be sufficiently advanced to allow them to superintend it. They will include poetry, the art on which all the rest are based, and the two most important of the special arts, music and drawing. Meantime, the pupil will become familiar with the principal Western languages, which are included in the study of poetry, since modern poetry cannot be properly appreciated without them. Moreover, independently of aesthetic considerations, a knowledge of them is most important morally, as a means of destroying national prejudices and of forming the true positivist standard of Occidental feeling. Each nation will be taught to consider it a duty to learn the language of contiguous countries, an obvious principle, which, in the case of Frenchmen, will involve their learning all the other 4 languages, as a consequence of that central position which gives them so many advantages. When this rule becomes general, and the natural affinities of the 5 advanced nations are brought fully into play, a common Occidental language will not be long in forming itself spontaneously, without the aid of any metaphysical scheme for producing a language that shall be absolutely universal. During the latter portion of primary education, which is devoted to the culture of the imaginative powers, the philosophic development of the individual, corresponding to that of the race, will carry him from the simple fetichism with which he began to the state of polytheism. This resemblance between the growth of the individual and that of society has always shown itself more or less, in spite of the irrational precautions of Christian teachers. They have never been able to give children a distaste for those simple tales of fairies and genii which are natural to this phase. The positivist teacher will let this tendency take its own course. It should not, however, involve any hypocrisy on the part of the parents, nor need it lead to any subsequent contradiction. The simple truth is enough. The child may be told that these spontaneous beliefs are but natural to his age, but that they will gradually lead him on to others by the fundamental law of all human development. Language of this kind will not only have the advantage of familiarizing him with a great principle of positivism, but will stimulate the nascent sense of sociability by leading him to sympathize with the various nations who still remain at his own primitive stage of intellectual development. The second part of positivist education cannot be conducted altogether at home, since it involves public lectures, in which of course the part taken by the parent can only be accessory. But this is no reason for depriving the pupil of the advantages of family life. It remains as indispensable as ever to his moral development, which is always to be the first consideration. It will be easy for him to follow the best masters without weakening his sense of personal and domestic morality, which is the almost inevitable result of the monastic seclusion of modern schools. The public school system is commonly thought to compensate for these disadvantages by the knowledge of the world which it gives. But this is better obtained by free intercourse with society, where sympathies are far more likely to be satisfied. Recognition of this truth would do much to facilitate and improve popular education, and it applies to all cases, except perhaps to some special professions, where seclusion of the pupils may still be necessary, though even in these cases probably it may be ultimately dispensed with. The plan to be followed in this period of education will obviously be that indicated by the encyclopedic law of classification, which forms part of my theory of development. Scientific study, whether for the working man or the philosopher, should begin with the inorganic world around us, and then pass to the subject of man and society, since our ideas on these two subjects form the basis of our practical action. The first class of studies, as I have stated before, includes 4 sciences, which we may arrange in pairs: mathematics and astronomy forming the first pair, physics and chemistry the second. To each of these pairs 2 years may be given, but as the first ranges over a wide field and is of greater logical importance, it will require 2 lectures weekly, whereas for all the subsequent studies 1 lecture will be sufficient. Besides, during these 2 years, the necessities of practical life will not press heavily, and more time may fairly be spent in mental occupation. From the study of inorganic science, the pupil will proceed to biology. This subject may easily be condensed in the 5th year into a series of 40 lectures, without really losing either its philosophic or its popular character. This concludes the introductory part of education. The student will now coordinate all his previous knowledge by the direct study of sociology, statically and dynamically viewed. On this subject also 40 lectures will be given, in which the structure and growth of human societies, especially those of modern times, will be clearly explained. With this foundation we come to the last of the 7 years of pupillage, in which the great social purpose of the scheme is at last reached. It will be devoted to a systematic exposition of moral science, the principles of which may be now fully understood by the light of the knowledge previously obtained of the world, of life, and of humanity. During this course of study, part of the 3 unoccupied months of each year will be spent in public examinations, to test the degree to which the instruction has been assimilated. The pupils will, of their own accord, continue their aesthetic pursuits, even supposing their natural tastes in this direction not to be encouraged as they ought to be. During the last 2 years, the Latin and Greek languages might be acquired as an accessory study, which would improve the poetic culture of the student and be useful to him in the historical and moral questions with which he will then be occupied. For the purposes of art, Greek is the more useful of the two, but in the second object, that of enabling us to realize our social filiation, Latin is of even greater importance. In the course of these 7 years, the philosophic development of the individual, preserving its correspondence with that of the race, will pass through its last phase. As the pupil passed before from fetichism to polytheism, so he will now pass as spontaneously into monotheism, induced by the influence on his imaginative powers, which hitherto have been supreme, of the spirit of discussion. No interference should be offered to this metaphysical transition, which is the homage that he pays to the necessary conditions under which mankind arrives at truth. There is something in this provisional phase which evidently harmonizes well with the abstract and independent character of mathematics, with which the 2 first years of the 7 are occupied. As long as more attention is given to deduction than to induction, the mind cannot but retain a leaning to metaphysical theories. Under their influence, the student will soon reduce his primitive theology to deism of a more or less distinct kind, and this during his physico-chemical studies will most likely degenerate into a species of atheism, which last phase, under the enlightening influence of biological and still more of sociological knowledge, will be finally replaced by positivism. Thus, at the time fixed for the ultimate study of moral science, each new member of humanity will have been strongly impressed by personal experience, with a sense of historical filiation, and will be enabled to sympathize with his ancestors and contemporaries while devoting his practical energies to the good of his successors. End of section 13. Section 14 of A General View of Positivism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Oxnard. A General View of Positivism by Auguste Comte. Translated by John Henry Bridges. Chapter 3. The Action of Positivism upon the Working Classes, Part 5. There is an excellent custom, prevalent among the working men of France, and creditable to their good sense, with which our educational scheme seems at first sight incompatible. I refer to the custom of travelling from place to place during the last years of apprenticeship, which is as beneficial to their mind and character as the purposeless excursions of our wealthy and idle classes are in most cases injurious. But there is no necessity for its interfering with study, since it always involves long residence in the chief centres of production, where the workman is sure to find annual courses of lectures similar to those which he would otherwise have been attending at home. As the structure and distribution of the philosophic body will be everywhere the same, there need be no great inconvenience in these changes. For every centre not more than 7 teachers will be required, each of whom will take the whole encyclopedic scale successively. Thus the total number of lectures will be so small as to admit of a high standard of merit being everywhere attained, and of finding everywhere a fair measure of material support. So far from discouraging the travelling system, Positivism will give it a new character, intellectually and socially, by extending the range of travel to the whole of Western Europe, since there is no part of it in which the workman will not be able to prosecute his education. The difference of language will then be no obstacle. Not only would the sense of fraternity among Western nations be strengthened by such a plan, but great improvement would result aesthetically. The languages of Europe would be learnt more thoroughly, and there would be a keener appreciation of works of art, whether musical, pictorial, or architectural, for these can never be properly appreciated but in the country which gave them birth. Judging by our present practice, it would seem impossible to include such a mass of important scientific studies as are here proposed in 360 lectures. But the length to which courses of lectures on any subject extend at present is owing partly to the special or professional object with which the course is given, and still more to the discursive and unphilosophical spirit of most of the teachers, consequent on the miserable manner in which our scientific system is organized. Such a regeneration of scientific studies as Positivism proposes will animate them with a social spirit, and thus give them a larger and more comprehensive tendency. Teachers will become more practiced in the art of condensing, and their lectures will be far more substantial. They will not indeed be a substitute for voluntary effort, on which all the real value of teaching depends. Their aim will be rather to direct such effort. A striking example, which is not so well remembered as it should be, will help to explain my meaning. At the first opening of the Polytechnic School, courses of lectures were given, very appropriately named revolutionary courses, which concentrated the teaching of 3 years into 3 months. What was in that case an extraordinary anomaly, due to republican enthusiasm, may become the normal state when a moral power arises not inferior in energy, and yet based upon a consistent intellectual synthesis, of which our great predecessors of the Revolution could have no conception. Little attention has hitherto been given to the didactic value of feeling. Since the close of the Middle Ages, the heart has been neglected in proportion as the mind has been cultivated. But it is the characteristic principle of Positivism, a principle as fertile in intellectual as in moral results, that the intellect, whether we look at its natural or at its normal position, is subordinate to social feeling. Throughout this course of popular education, parents and masters will seize every suitable occasion for calling social feeling into play, and the most abstruse subjects will often be vivified by its influence. The office of the mind is to strengthen and to cultivate the heart. The heart again should animate and direct the mental powers. This mutual influence of general views and generous feelings will have greater effect upon scientific study from the aesthetic culture previously given, in which such habits of mind will have been formed, as will give grace and beauty to the whole life. When I speak of this education as specially destined for the people, I am not merely using words to denote its comprehensiveness and philosophic character. It is, in my opinion, the only education, with the exception of certain special branches, for which public organization is needed. It should be looked on as a sacred debt, which the Republic owes to the working classes. But the claim does not extend to other classes who can easily pay for any special instruction that they may require. Besides, such instruction will be only a partial development of the more general teaching, or an application of it to some particular purpose. Therefore, if the general training be sound, most people will be able to prosecute accessory studies by themselves. Apprenticeship to any business involves very little, except the practice of it. Even in the highest arts, no course of systematic instruction is necessary. The false views now prevalent on the subject are due to the unfortunate absence of all general education since the decay of Catholicism. The special institutions founded in Europe during the last 3 centuries, and carefully remodelled in France by the Convention, are only valuable as containing certain germs of truth, which will be found indispensable when general education is finally reorganized. But important as they may be from a scientific aspect, their practical utility, which seems to have been the motive for establishing them, is exceedingly doubtful. The arts which they were intended to promote could have done perfectly well without them. I include in these remarks such institutions as the Polytechnic School, the Museum of Natural History, etc. Their value, like that of all good institutions of modern times, is purely provisional. Viewed in this light, it may be worth our while to reorganize them. Positivist principles, discarding all attempts to make them permanent, will be all the better able to adapt them to their important temporary purpose. Indeed, there are some new institutions which it might be advisable to form, such, for instance, as a school of comparative philology, the object of which would be to range all human languages according to their true affinities. This would compensate the suppression of Greek and Latin professorships, which is certainly an indispensable measure. But the whole of this provisional framework would no doubt disappear before the end of the 19th century, when a system of general education will have been thoroughly organized. The present necessity for a provisional system should lead to no misconception of its character and purpose. Working men are the only class who have a real claim upon the state for instruction, and this, if wisely organized, dispenses with the necessity of special institutions. The adoption of these views would at once facilitate and ennoble popular education. Nations, provinces, and towns will vie with one another in inviting the best teachers that the spiritual authorities of Western Europe can supply. And every true philosopher will take pride in such teaching, when it becomes generally understood that the popular character of his lectures implies that they shall be at the same time systematic. Members of the new spiritual power will in most cases regard teaching as their principal occupation, for at least a considerable portion of their public life. What has been said makes it clear that any organization of such education as this at the present time would be impossible. However sincere the intentions of governments to effect this great result might be, any premature attempt to do it would but injure the work, especially if they put in a claim to superintend it. The truth is that a system of education, if it deserves the name, presupposes the acceptance of a definite philosophical and social creed to determine its character and purpose. Children cannot be brought up in convictions contrary to those of their parents. Indeed, the influence of the parent is essential to the instructor. Opinions and habits that have been already formed may subsequently be strengthened by an educational system. But the carrying out of any such system is impossible until the principles of combined action and belief have been well established. Till then, the organization that we propose can only be effected in the case of individuals who are ripe for it. Each of these will endeavor to repair the faults and deficiencies of his own education in the best way he can, by the aid of the general doctrine which he accepts. Assuming that the doctrine is destined to triumph, the number of such minds gradually increases, and they superintend the social progress of the next generation. This is the natural process, and no artificial interference can dispense with it. So far, then, from inviting governments to organize education, we ought rather to exhort it to abdicate the educational powers which it already holds, and which, I refer more especially to France, are either useless or a source of discord. There are only two exceptions to this remark, namely primary education and special instruction in certain higher branches. Of these I have already spoken, but with these exceptions it is most desirable that government, whether municipal or central, should surrender its unreasonable monopoly and establish real liberty of teaching, the condition of such liberty being, as I said before, the suppression of all annual grants whatsoever for theological or metaphysical purposes. Until some universal faith has been accepted on its own merits, all attempts made by government to reform education must necessarily be reactionary, since they will always be based on some one of the retrogressive creeds which it is our object to supersede altogether. It is with adults then that we must deal. We must endeavour to disseminate systematic convictions among them, and thus open the door to a real reform of education for the next generation. The press and the power of free speech offer many ways of bringing about this result. The most important of these would be a more or less connected series of popular lectures on the various positive sciences, including history, which may now be ranked among them. Now, for these lectures to produce their full effect, they must, even when treating of the most elementary point in mathematics, be thoroughly philosophic and consequently animated by a social spirit. They must be entirely independent of government, so as not to be hampered by any of the authorized views. Lastly, there is a condition in which all the rest are summed up. These lectures should be occidental, not simply national. What we require is a free association of philosophers throughout Western Europe, formed by the voluntary cooperation of all who can contribute efficiently to this great preliminary work. their services being essentially gratuitous. It is a result which no system but Positivism is capable of effecting. By its agency, that coalition between philosophers and the working classes, on which so much depends, will speedily be established. While the work of propagating positivist convictions is going on in the free and unrestricted manner here described, the spiritual authority will at the same time be forming itself, and will be prepared to make use of these convictions as the basis for social regeneration. Thus the transitional state will be brought as nearly as possible into harmony with the normal state, and this the more in proportion as the natural affinity between philosophers and workmen is brought out more distinctly. The connection between positivist lectures and positivist clubs will illustrate my meaning. While the lectures prepare the way for the future, the clubs work in the same direction by judging the past and advising for the present, so that we have at once a beginning of the three essential functions of the new spiritual power. We have now a clear conception of popular education in its provisional and in its normal state. Long before the normal state can be realized, the mutual action of philosophers and workmen will have done great service to both. Meeting with such powerful support from the people, the rising spiritual power will win the respect, if not the affection, of their rulers, even of those among them who are now the most contemptuous of every influence but that of material power. Their excess of pride will often be so far humbled that they will invite its mediation in cases where the people have been roused to just indignation. The force of numbers seems at first so violent as to carry all before it, but in the end it usually proves far inferior to that of wealth. It cannot exist for any length of time without complete convergence of opinion and feeling. Hence, a spiritual power has very great weight in controlling or directing its action. Philosophers will never, indeed, be able to manage the working classes as they please, as some unprincipled agitators have imagined. But when they exercise their authority rightly, whether it be in the cause of order or that of progress, they will have great power over their passions and conduct. Such influence can only spring from long-cherished feelings of gratitude and trust, due not merely to presumed capacity, but to services actually rendered. No one is a fit representative of his own claims, but the philosopher may honourably represent the cause of working men before the governing classes, and the people will in their turn compel their rulers to respect the new spiritual power. By this habitual exchange of services, the aspirations of the people will be kept clear of all subversive tendencies, and philosophers will be led to abandon the folly of seeking political power. Neither class will degrade itself by making its own interest the chief consideration. Each will find its own reward in keeping to the nobler course of its own social duty. To complete this view of the political attitude which Positivism recommends to the working class, I have now to speak of the intellectual and moral conditions which that attitude requires, and on which the character of their spiritual leaders depends. What is wanted is only a more perfect development of tendencies which already exist in the people, and which have already shown themselves strong in Paris, the centre of the great Western movement. Intellectually, the principal conditions are two: emancipation from obsolete beliefs, and a sufficient amount of mental culture. The emancipation of the working classes from theology is complete, at least in Paris. In no other class has it so entirely lost its power. The shallow deism which satisfies so many of our literary men finds little favour with the people. They are happily unversed in studies of words and abstractions, without which this last stage in the process of emancipation speedily comes to an end. We only require a stronger expression of popular feeling on this point, so as to avoid all deception and false statement as to the intellectual character of the reorganization that is going on. And the freedom that we are now enjoying will admit of these feelings being unmistakably manifested, especially now that they have the new philosophy for their exponent. A distinct declaration of opinion on this subject is urgently needed on social grounds. That hypocritical affectation of theological belief against which we have to fight is designed to prevent, or at least has the effect of preventing, the just enforcement of popular claims. These unscrupulous attempts to mystify the people involve their mental subjection. The result is that their legitimate aspirations for real progress are evaded by diverting their thoughts towards an imaginary future state. It is for the working classes themselves to break through this concerted scheme, which is even more contemptible than it is odious. They have only to declare without disguise what their intellectual position really is, and to do this so emphatically as to make any mistake on the part of the governing classes impossible. They will consequently reject all teachers who are insufficiently emancipated, or who in any way support the system of theological hypocrisy, which, from Robespierre downwards, has been the refuge of all reactionists, whether Democrat or Royalist. But there are teachers of another kind, who sincerely maintain that our life here on earth is a temporary banishment, and that we ought to take as little interest in it as possible. A prompt answer may be given to such instructors as these. They should be requested to follow out their principle consistently, and to cease to interfere in the management of a world which is so alien to what, in their ideas, is the sole aim of life. Metaphysical principles have more hold on our working classes than theological, yet their abandonment is equally necessary. The subtle extravagances by which the German mind has been so confused find, it is true, little favour in Catholic countries, but even in Paris the people retains a prejudice in favour of metaphysical instruction, though happily it has not been able to obtain it. It is most desirable that this last illusion of our working classes should be dissipated, as it forms the one great obstacle to their social action. One reason for it is that they fall into the common error of confounding knowledge with intelligence, and imagine in their modesty that none but instructed men are capable of governing. Now this error, natural as it is, often leads them to choose incompetent leaders. A truer estimate of modern society would teach them that it is not among our literary, or even our scientific men, proud as they may be of their attainments, that the largest number of really powerful intellects are to be found. There are more of them among the despised practical class, and even amongst the most uninstructed working men. In the Middle Ages this truth was better known than it is now. Education was thought more of than instruction. A knight would be appreciated for his sagacity and penetration, and appointed to important posts, though he might be extremely ignorant. Clear-sightedness, wisdom, and even consistency of thought are qualities which are very independent of learning, and, as matters now stand, they are far better cultivated in practical life than in scholastic study. In breadth of view, which lies at the root of all political capacity, our literary classes have certainly shown themselves far below the average. And now we come to another and a deeper reason for the prejudice of which I am speaking. It is that they make no distinction between one kind of instruction and another. The unfortunate confidence which they still bestow on literary men and lawyers shows that the prestige of pedantry lingers among them longer than the prestige of theology or monarchy. But all this will soon be altered under the influence of republican government, and the strong discipline of a sound philosophical system. Popular instinct will soon discover that constant practice of the faculty of expression, whether in speech or in writing, is no guarantee for real power of thought. Indeed, that it has a tendency to incapacitate men from forming a clear and decided judgment on any question. The instruction which such men receive is utterly deficient in solid principles, and it almost always either presupposes or causes a total absence of fixed convictions. Most minds thus trained, while skilled in putting other men's thoughts into shape, become incapable of distinguishing true from false in the commonest subjects, even when their own interest requires it. The people must give up the feeling of blind respect which leads them to entrust such men with their higher interests. Reverence for superiors is doubtless indispensable to a well-ordered state, only it needs to be better guided than it is now. What then, working men may ask, is the proper training for themselves and consequently for those who claim to guide them? The answer is systematic cultivation of the positive spirit. It is already called into exercise by their daily occupations, and all that is wanted is to strengthen it by a course of scientific study. Their daily work involves a rudimentary application of the positive method. It turns their attention to many most important natural laws. In fact, the workmen of Paris, whom I take as the best type of their class, have a clearer sense of that union of reality with utility by which the positive spirit is characterized than most of our scientific men. The specialty of their employment is no doubt disadvantageous with respect to breadth and coherence of ideas, but it leaves the mind free from responsibility, and this is the most favourable condition for developing these qualities to which all vigorous intellects are naturally disposed. But nothing will so strongly impress on the people the importance of extending and organizing their scientific knowledge as their interest in social questions. Their determination to rectify a faulty condition of society will suggest to them that they must first know what the laws of social life really are, knowledge which is obviously necessary in every other subject. They will then feel how impossible it is to understand the present state of society without understanding its relation on the one hand with the past and on the other with the future. Their desire to modify the natural course of social phenomena will make them anxious to know the antecedents and consequences of these phenomena, so as to avoid all mischievous or useless interference. They will thus discover that political art is even more dependent than other arts upon its corresponding science. And then they will soon see that this science is no isolated department of knowledge, but that it involves preliminary study of man and of the world. In this way they will pass downwards through the hierarchic scale of positive conceptions until they come back to the inorganic world, the sphere more immediately connected with their own special avocations. And thus they will reach the conclusion that Positivism is the only system which can satisfy either the intellectual or material wants of the people, since its subject matter and its objects are identical with their own, and since, like themselves, it subordinates everything to social considerations. All that it claims is to present in a systematic form principles which they already hold instinctively. By coordinating these principles of morality and good sense, their value, whether in public or in private questions, is largely increased, and the union of the two forms of wisdom, theoretical and practical wisdom, is permanently secured. When all this is understood, the people will feel some shame at having entrusted questions of the greatest complexity to minds that have never quite comprehended the difference between a cubic inch and a cubic foot. As to men of science, in the common acceptation of the word, who are so respected by the middle classes, we need not be afraid of their gaining much influence with the people. They are alienated from them by their utter indifference to social questions, and before these their learned puerilities fade into insignificance. Absorbed in the details of their own special science, they are quite incapable of satisfying unsophisticated minds. What the people want is to have clear conceptions on all subjects, d'éclater de tout, as Molière has it. Whenever the savants of our time are drawn by their foolish ambition into politics, ordinary men find to their surprise that, except in a few questions of limited extent and importance, their minds have become thoroughly narrow under the influence of the specializing system of which they are so proud. Positivism explains the mystery by showing that, since the necessity for the specializing system now no longer exists, it naturally results, if prolonged, in a sort of academic idiocy. During the last 3 centuries it did real service to society by laying down the scientific groundwork for the renovation of philosophy projected by Bacon and Descartes. But as soon as the groundwork was sufficiently finished to admit of the formation of true science, that is, of science viewed relatively to humanity, the specializing method became retrograde. It ceased to be of any assistance to the modern spirit, and indeed it is now, especially in France, a serious obstacle to its diffusion and systematic working. The wise revolutionists of the Convention were well aware of this when they took the bold step of suppressing the Academy of Sciences. The beneficial results of this statesmanlike policy will soon be appreciated by our workmen. The danger lest, in withdrawing their confidence from metaphysicians or literary men, they should fall into the bad scientific spirit, is not therefore very great. With the social aims which they have in view, they cannot but see that generality in their conceptions is as necessary as positivity. The capitalist class by which industry is directed, being more concentrated on special objects, will always look on men of pure science with more respect. But the people will be drawn by their political leanings towards philosophers in the true sense of that word. The number of such men is but very small at present, but it will soon increase at the call of the working classes, and will indeed be recruited from their ranks. This then should be the attitude of the working class intellectually. Morally, what is required is that they should have a sufficient sense of the dignity of labour, and that they should be prepared for the mission that now lies before them. End of section 14.
Section 15 of A General View of Positivism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A General View of Positivism by Auguste Comte. Translated by John Henry Bridges. Section 15. Chapter 3. The Action of Positivism upon the Working Class. Part 6. The workman must learn to look upon himself morally as a public servant with functions of a special and also of a general kind. Not that he is to receive his wages for the future from the state instead of from a private hand. The present plan is perfectly well adapted to all services which are so direct and definite that a common standard of value can be at once applied to them. Only let it be understood that the service is not sufficiently recompensed without the social feeling of gratitude towards the agent that performs it. In what are called liberal professions, this feeling already obtains. The client or patient is not dispensed from gratitude by payment of his fee. In this respect, the republican instincts of the Convention have anticipated the teaching of philosophy. They valued the workman's labor at its true worth. Workmen have only to imagine labor suppressed or even suspended in the trade to which they may belong to see its importance to the whole fabric of modern society. Their general function as a class, the function of forming public opinion and of supporting the action of the spiritual power, it is of course less easy for them to understand at present. But as I have already shown, it follows so naturally from their character and position, and corresponds so perfectly with their requirements as a class, that they cannot fail to appreciate its importance, when the course of events allows, or rather compels them to bring it into play. The only danger lies in their insisting on the possession of what metaphysicians call political rights, and engaging in useless discussions about the distribution of power, instead of fixing their attention on the manner in which it is used. Of this, however, there is no great fear, at all events in France, where the metaphysical theory of right has never reached so fanatical a pitch with the working classes as elsewhere. Ideologists may blame them, and may use their official influence as they will, but the people have too much good sense to be permanently misled as to their true function in society. Deluged as they have been with electoral votes, they will soon voluntarily abandon this useless qualification, which now has not even the claim of a privilege. Questions of pure politics have ceased to interest the people. Their attention is fixed and will remain fixed on social questions, which are to be solved for the most part through moral agencies. That substitutions of one person or party for another, or that mere modifications of any kind in the administration should be looked on as the final issue of the great revolution, is a result in which they will never acquiesce. And if this is to be the attitude of the people, it must be the attitude no less of those who seek to gain their confidence. With them, as with the people, political questions should be subordinate to social questions, and with them the conviction should even be more distinct, that the solution of social problems depends essentially on moral agencies. They must in fact accept the great principle of separation of spiritual from temporal powers as the basis on which modern society is to be prominently organized. So entirely does the principle meet the wants of the people, that they will soon insist on its adoption by their teachers. They will accept none who do not formally abandon any prospects that they may have a temporal power, parliamentary as well as administrative, and by thus dedicating their lives without reservation to the priesthood of humanity, they will gain confidence not merely from the people, but from the governing classes. Governments will offer no impediment to social speculations which do not profess to be susceptible to immediate application, and thus the normal state may be prepared for in the future without disturbance, and yet without neglecting the present. Practical statesmen, meanwhile, no longer interfered with by pretentious sophists, will give up their retrograde tendencies, and will gradually adapt their policy to the new ideas current in the public mind, while discharging the indispensable function of maintaining material order. For the people to rise to the true level of their position, they have only to develop and cultivate certain dispositions which already exist in them spontaneously, and the most important of these, absence of ambition for wealth or rank. Political metaphysicians would say that the sole object of the great revolution was to give the working classes easier access to political and civil power. But this, though it should always be open to them, is very far from meeting their true wants. Individuals among them may be benefited by it, but the mass is left unaffected, or rather is placed often in a worse position, by the desertion of the more energetic members. The Convention is the only government by which this result has been properly appreciated. It is the only government which has shown due consideration for working men as such, which has recognized the value of their services, and encouraged what is the chief compensation for their condition of poverty, their participation in public life. All subsequent governments, whether retrograde or constitutional, have, on the contrary, done all they could to divert people from their true social functions, by affording opportunity for individuals among them to rise to higher positions. The moneyed class, under the influence of blind routine, have lent their aid to this degrading policy, by continually preaching to the people the necessity of saving, a precept which is indeed incumbent on their own class, but not on others. Without saving, capital could not be accumulated and administered. It is therefore of the highest importance that the moneyed classes should be as economical as possible. But in other classes, and especially in those dependent on fixed wages, parsimonious habits are uncalled for and injurious. They lower the character of the laborer, while they do little or nothing to improve his physical condition, and neither the working classes nor their teachers should encourage them. Both the one and the other will find their true happiness in keeping clear of all serious practical responsibility, and allowing free play of their mental and moral faculties in public as well as private life. In spite of the economists, savings banks are regarded by the working classes with unmistakable repugnance, and the repugnance is justified. They do harm morally by checking the exercise of generous feelings. Again, it is the fashion to declaim against wine shops. And yet, after all, they are at present the only places where the people can enjoy society. Social instincts are cultivated there which deserve our approval far more than the self-helping spirit which carries them to the savings bank. No doubt this unconcern for money, wise as it is, involves real personal risk. But it is a danger which civilization is constantly tending to diminish, without effacing qualities which do the workman honor, and which are the source of his most cherished pleasures. The danger ceases when the mental and moral faculties are called into stronger exercise. The interest which Positivism will arouse among the people in public questions will lead to the substitution of the club for the wine shop. In these questions, the generous inspirations of popular instinct hold out a model, which philosophers will do well to follow themselves. Fondness for money is as much a disqualification for the spiritual government of humanity as political ambition. It is a clear proof of moral incompetence, which is generally connected in one way or other with intellectual feebleness. One of the principal results of the spiritual power exercised by philosophers and the working classes under the Positivist system will be to compensate by the just distribution of blame and praise for the imperfect arrangements of social rank, in which wealth must always preponderate. Leaving the present subordination of offices untouched, each functionary will be judged by the intrinsic worth of his mind and heart, without servility, and yet without any encouragement to anarchy. It must always be obvious that the political importance which high position gives is out of all proportion to the real merit implied in gaining that position. The people will come to see more and more clearly that real happiness, so far from depending on rank, is far more compatible with their own humble station. Exceptional men no doubt there are, whose character impels them to seek power, a character more dangerous than useful, unless there be sufficient wisdom in the social body to turn it to good account. The best workmen, like the best philosophers, will soon cease to feel envy for greatness, laden as it always must be with heavy responsibilities. At present the compensation which I hold out to them has not been realized. But when it exists, the people will feel that their spiritual and temporal leaders are combining all the energies of society for the satisfaction of their wants. Recognizing this, they will care but little for fame that must be bought by long and tedious meditation, or for power burdened with constant care. There are men whose talents call them to these important duties, and they will be left free to perform them. But the great mass of society will be well satisfied that their own lot is one far more in keeping with the constitution of their own nature, more compatible with that harmonious exercise of the faculties of thought, feeling, and action, which is most conducive to happiness. The immediate pressure of poverty once removed, the highest reward of honorable conduct will be found in the permanent esteem, posthumous as it may be sometimes, of that portion of humanity which has witnessed it. In a word, the title Servus Servorum, which is still retained by the papacy from false humility, but which originated in anticipation of a social truth, is applicable to all functionaries in high position. They may be described as the involuntary servants of voluntary subordinates. It is not chimerical to conceive Positivist policy so organized that its theoretical and practical directors, with all their personal advantages, will often regret that they were not born, or that they did not remain, in the condition of workmen. The only solid satisfaction which great minds have hitherto found in political or spiritual power has been that, being more occupied by public interests, they had a wider scope for the exercise of social feeling. But the excellence of the future condition of society will be that the possibility of combining public and private life will be open to all. The humblest citizen will be able to influence not by command but by counsel, in proportion to his energy and worth. All the views brought forward in this chapter bear out the statement with which it began, that the proletariat forms the principal basis of the social system, not merely as finally constituted, but in its present state of transition. And admitting this, the present state will be seen to have no essential difference from the normal future to which it tends. The principal conditions of our transitional policy were described at the conclusion of the last chapter. The security for these conditions is to be found in the natural tendencies of the people of Western Europe, and especially of France. Our governments will do well to follow these tendencies instead of attempting to lead them, for they are in perfect keeping with the two great requirements of the present time, liberty and public order. Liberty of thought and speech is enjoyed in France, and especially in Paris, to an extent impossible in any other country. And it is due principally to the intellectual emancipation of our workmen. They have rid themselves of theology in all its forms, and they have not accepted any metaphysical system. At the same time, though totally devoid at present of systematic convictions, there is in them a submissiveness of mind which predisposes them to receive convictions combining reality with utility. In all other classes there is a tendency to use forcible measures in spreading their doctrines, when discussion fails. It is only to the people that philosophers can look for the support and extension of liberty, which is so essential to their objects, and from this they derive moral confidence far more reassuring than any legal security. However reactionary or stationary the views of particular leaders or sects may be, with such a population as that of Paris, no real oppression is possible. Of all the claims which France has to the leadership of Europe, this is the strongest. The resistance which is still offered to freedom of association and freedom of education will soon be overcome by the force of its liberal sympathies. A population of such strong social feelings as ours will certainly not allow itself to be permanently deprived of the power of meeting together freely in clubs, institutions most conducive both to its cultural and to the protection of its interests. It will insist with equal force upon perfect liberty of teaching, feeling deeply the need of solid instruction and the incapacity of metaphysicians and theologians to give it. Without popular pressure, the essential conditions of educational liberty will always be evaded. And if liberty depends on popular support, public order, whether at home or abroad, depends on it no less. The inclinations of the working classes are altogether on the side of peace. Their strong dislike of war is the principal reason of the present remarkable tranquillity of Europe. The foolish regret expressed by all the retrograde parties for the decline of the military spirit is a sufficient indication of what the popular feeling is. But even more significant is the necessity for compulsory enlistment, which began in France and has extended to other parts of Europe. There has been much factitious indignation on the subject, but at least it must be allowed that in our armies the officers are the only volunteers. Again, the working class is more free than any other from international prejudices, which still disunite the great family of Western nations, although they are very much weaker than formerly. They are strongest in the middle classes, a fact primarily due to industrial competition. But working men feel how similar their wants and their conditions are in all countries, and this feeling checks their animosity. And the consciousness of union will become far stronger, now that the great social problem of their incorporation into modern society is being raised everywhere. No errors that statesmen can commit, whether in matters of war or peace, can prevent this from becoming the preponderating question in every European country, and thus it tends to preserve their mutual concord. Popular sympathies of this sort are, it may be said, less conducive to internal tranquillity than to pacific foreign relations. But the alarm which is naturally aroused by the spiritual anarchy around us must not blind us to the real guarantees for order which popular tendencies, rightly interpreted, hold out. It is to the people that we must look for the ascendancy of central over local power, which, as we have seen, is so indispensable to public order. The executive authority, provided only that it gives no cause to fear reaction, will always have their support when opposed by an assembly the prevalent tendencies of which will usually be adverse to their interests. They will always turn instinctively to the dictatorial rather than to the parliamentary branch of the administration, feeling that from its practical character and the directness of its action, it is more likely to meet their wants. Useless discussions on constitutional questions may suit ambitious members of the middle classes by facilitating their arrival to power. But the people take very little interest in all this unmeaning agitation, and often treat it with merited contempt. They know that it can be of no use to them, and that its only result is to evade their real wants by undermining the only authority that can do them justice. Consequently, the people are certain to give their support to every government that deserves it, especially in France, where political passions have already yielded to the superior and more permanent interests of social questions. And while strengthening the government, they may do much to elevate its character by confining it strictly to its practical function, and resisting any attempt that it may make to interfere with opinion. In all these respects, the spontaneous influence of the working classes will be of material assistance in carrying out the systematic conceptions of social philosophy. But a more striking proof of the political influence to be exercised by the people is this: the dictatorship which our transitional policy requires, as long as the spiritual interregnum lasts, must arise in the first instance from their ranks. In the word people, especially in the French language, there is a fortunate ambiguity, which may serve to remind us that the proletariat class is not, properly speaking, a class at all, but constitutes the body of society. From it proceed the various special classes, which we may regard as organs necessary to that body. Since the abolition of royalty, the last remnant of caste, our political leaders have been recruited and will continue to be so from the working class, and in the normal state, however, it will be required as a preliminary condition that the holder of dictatorial power shall have first received the political training which is given by the exercise of authority in his own business. In a settled state of society, government strictly so called is a mere extension of civil influence. Ultimately, therefore, political power will fall into the hands of the great leaders of industry. As spiritual reorganization proceeds, they will gradually become more worthy of it than they are at present. Besides, the tenure of power will become less burdensome, because it will be confined to duties of a purely practical kind. As yet, however, the case is very different, and therefore the wealthy, though ultimately they will be the administrators of power, are not those to whom it should, as a rule, be entrusted in our present condition. Special departments may be given to them with advantage, as we have seen proved recently, and that in cases where the functions to be performed had no relation whatever to industrial skill. But they are not competent as yet for dictatorial power, the power which has to supply the place of royalty. Individual exemptions, of course, there may be, though none have appeared hitherto, and at least they are not enough for our provisional system to rely on. As yet the wealthy classes have shown themselves too debased in thought and feeling for an office of such importance, nor do we find greater aptitude for it outside the industrial class. Scientific men are most assuredly unfit for it, especially in France, where the system of academies has narrowed the mind, withered the feelings, and enervated the character to such an extent that most of them fail in the conduct of common life, and are utterly unworthy of the smallest post of authority, even in their own department. All other classes failing us, we have to look to the working class, which has been left more free to form broad views, and in which the sense of duty has been better cultivated. On historical grounds, I feel convinced that the workmen of France are more likely than any other class to supply men competent for supreme power, as long as the spiritual interregnum lasts, that is, for at least one generation. On looking at this question calmly and without scholastic or aristocratic prejudice, it will be seen, as I have pointed out at the beginning of this chapter, that the working class is better situated than any other with respect to generality of views and generosity of feeling. In knowledge and experience of administration they would ordinarily be deficient. They would therefore not be fit for the work of any special department. But there is no disqualification for the supreme power, or indeed for any of the higher offices, for which breadth of view rather than special knowledge is required. These may be filled by working men whose good sense and modesty will at once lead them to choose their agents for special departments from the classes who have usually furnished them before. The practical character and progressive spirit of such a government being beyond suspicion, special talent of whatever kind may be made available, even in the case of men who, if they had been placed in a higher position, would have proved thoroughly hostile to republican institutions. Of all the diversified elements of modern society, there is not one which may not be of real service to assisting the transition. Among soldiers and magistrates, for instance, there are many who will join the popular movement and become sincere supporters of republicanism. The government of this kind would tranquilize the people, would obviate the necessity for violent compressive measures, and would at the same time be a most beneficial influence on the capitalist class. It would show them the necessity of attaining a greater purity of feeling and greater breadth of view, if they are to become worthy of the position for which they are ultimately destined. Thus, whether we look at the interests of public order or at those of liberty, it appears necessary as a provisional measure, during the continuance of our spiritual interregnum, that the holders of dictatorial power shall be chosen from the working class. The success of a few working men in the pursuit of wealth has exercised an unsettling influence on the rest, but in the present instance we need not fear this result. It will be obvious that the career of a proletary governor is a rare exception, and one which requires peculiar endowments. In examining the mode in which this anomalous policy should be carried out, we must bear in mind the object with which it was instituted. It is most important to get rid of the custom based on motives of self-interest, which has grown up during the last generation, of insisting on parliamentary experience as an apprenticeship for executive power. Executive power being always the real object of ambition. We have found from experience what we might have anticipated on theoretical grounds, that this plan excludes all except mere talkers of the Girondin types, men totally devoid of statesmanlike qualities. To working men it offers almost insurmountable obstacles, and even supposing these obstacles to be overcome, we may be sure that they would lose their straightforwardness and native vigor, which constitute their best claim to the exceptional provision proposed for them. It is best, then, that they should reach the position assigned to them at once, without the circuitous process of a parliamentary career. Our transition towards the normal state will then exhibit its true character. It will be tranquil and yet decisive, for it will rest on the combined actions of philosophers without political ambition, and dictators averse to spiritual encroachment. The teacher who attempts to govern, the governor who attempts to educate, will both incur severe public censure, as enemies alike of peace and progress. The whole result will be a change in our revolutionary condition, identical with that which the Convention would have realized, if, as its founders contemplated, it had lasted till the peace. Such then is the nature of the compact into which all true philosophers should enter with the leading members of the proletary class. Their object is to direct the organic and final phase through which the great revolution is now passing. What they have to do is carefully to prolong the provisional system adopted by the Convention, and to ignore, as far as possible, the traditions of all succeeding governments, whether stationary or retrograde. Comprehensiveness of view and social sympathy predominate alike in both members of this great alliance, and it is thus a guarantee for our present state of transition, and a sure earnest of the normal future. The people are the spontaneous representatives of this alliance, the philosophers its systematic organ. The intellectual deficiencies of the former will easily be remedied by philosophers, who will show them how essential it is on social grounds that they should understand the true meaning of history, since otherwise their conception of the union of mankind must be limited to the present generation, ignoring the more important truth of the continuity of the present with the past and the future. A far greater obstacle is the moral deficiency of most philosophers of our time. But the wholesome influence of the people upon them, combined with a deep philosophic conviction of the preponderance of feeling in every subject of thought, will do much to overcome the ambitious instincts which weaken and distract their energies in the common cause of social renovation. Chapter 4